It's good to have you back for another day as we are continuing on with our Bible study through the book of Nehemiah. If you'd like more information about this study, how you can be a part, the entire reading schedule, you can visit that URL right there at the bottom of your screen, go.christtable.today/reconstruct. If you'd like to find out more about who we are here at Christ Table, would encourage you to visit right there, www.christtable.today. Sign up for our email list there, and also consider making a donation if you find these helpful to you. And we have every 2 months a box that we send through the mail of spiritual resources that we give just absolutely for free to those who are regular financial contributors here at Christ Table. We've got one coming out here in a couple of weeks for the holidays, and we are feverishly working on that one to get it ready, and it's going to be super awesome and can't wait to put it into your hands. Well, this week we are bringing the study of Nehemiah in for a landing, and it has been quite a roller coaster ride as we've kind of torn down the wall of many older interpretations of Nehemiah and said that it is perhaps not a hero story, but a cautionary tale. And these next few final days this week in Nehemiah are going to kind of seal the deal, I think, on that, but it's up to you as to how you see it. So we find ourselves today finally starting the final chapter in Nehemiah 13, and we are in the first 14 verses of that chapter. And it's going to be an interesting ride. And so I'm looking forward to doing these final few days with you and seeing what you think. And as always, before I jump in here, I love to see your feedback in the comments. Your feedback, your questions, what you thought, how you're diving into the readings and what you're finding in the text and what you're seeing and what you're not seeing as well. So I always love to see and to hear those things. So why don't we just jump into the text, and along the way I'll hit pause and make a couple of comments, and we'll see where it takes us. So verse 1 of chapter 13, on that same day as the book of Moses was being read to the people, the passage was found that said no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be permitted to enter the assembly of God, for they had not provided the Israelites with food and with water in the wilderness. So let me just hit pause right there and say, timeline-wise, this is, we're not sure. I'm not sure where they're going back to, but on that same day, it may be the same day of the dedication where the wall was being dedicated. It could be the same day where Ezra was reading it earlier. The difficulty sometimes that we have with the book of Nehemiah, because it seems to have been a compilation of Nehemiah's journal and then some historical records, and then maybe somebody else who's filling in with other information. You know, like we've said, this is like part 2 of Ezra. It was all one book, Ezra and Nehemiah, but in most of our Bibles, it's split up. Sometimes the timeline, it's not linear through these books. And so we think, though, that this probably could be the same day as the festival, but we just can't speak assuredly of that. What we can speak assuredly of is that there is some difficulty here in the relationship between them, the Israelites, and everybody else. And so as they're reading this book of the law of Moses, they come across this passage. And I want to make sure that I get the passage right. I'm not going to put it up, but you can look into it if you want. Deuteronomy chapter 23. So they're reading through the book of Moses, and they get to Deuteronomy chapter 23, and then verses 3 through 6 is where this reference is to, that says that no Ammonite or Moabite should be allowed to enter the assembly of God, for they had not provided the Israelites with food and water in the wilderness. Now, this is written in Deuteronomy at least 700 years ago. I just want you to think about that. Think about 700 years ago. 700 years ago from now is what? The 1200s? The 1300s, I guess. I wasn't a math major. The 1300s. 700 years ago, the United States. Think how far Columbus's voyages in the 14th. Like, this is a really long time to hold a grudge for not providing food and water to the Israelites in the wilderness. 700 years. Now, okay, did God give any end to that? Well, I think that's a good point. Did God intend for that law to be in place in perpetuity, forever and ever? The law doesn't seem to give an out for it, but God has also said clearly in Isaiah that the desire is that all nations would come to the temple and worship him in this period post-exile. So I think it's questionable at best in this moment whether or not this law should be applied here. But let's give him the benefit of the doubt. So instead of providing food and water to Israel in the wilderness, they hired Balaam to curse them, though our God turned the curse into a blessing. So when this passage of the law was read, here we have commentary now on the event. When this passage of the law was read, all of those of foreign descent were immediately excluded from the assembly. Let's go back. The passage was found to say that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be permitted to enter into the assembly of God. So we have two very specific tribes of people. Ammonites, Moabites, people of Ammon, people of Moab. But here now in verse 3, when the passage of law was read, all those of foreign descent were immediately excluded from the assembly. Not just Moabites, not just Ammonites, but all foreign people. So if God said that a small group of foreign people should not be included into the assembly because they did not provide food or water for us in the wilderness 700 years ago, then vis-a-vis everybody should be excluded who wasn't a part of that wilderness experience, because really nobody helped us. So we're just gonna clearly God meant everybody, but only said Ammonites and Moabites. This is an overreach. This is taking what God said 700 years ago, and it's going not 2 steps beyond it, not 3 steps beyond it, but it is going far afield in creating this now new law that says no one of foreign descent now is allowed into the worship space. And the overreach beyond what God has said always betrays the true heart. This is why we've continued to say this is not a hero story. This is a story of exclusion and going beyond what God has asked and then blaming it on God. Well, God said all people should be excluded. God said he didn't want those people coming into his temple. God said we should build a wall around this temple in order to ensure that nobody who is not A-OK can be a part of this. No, 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 no. This isn't a reflection of God's heart. This is a reflection of their hearts. Now, before this had happened, Eliashib, the priest, who had been appointed as supervisor of the storerooms of the temple of God and who was also a relative of Tobiah, had converted a large storeroom and placed it at Tobiah's disposal. Remember, we spoke a few days ago about how when they read the law, they realized that there was lots of things that needed to be stored in the temple, and there was a whole process and an organizational system and an administration that had been put in place. And so they wanted to follow the letter of the law and then go beyond the letter of the law. And so this is kind of what we're referencing here, is some of these past things. But the priest, who was a relative of Tobiah, and Tobiah is not a new name to us, remember, he is one of the ones who pushed back against the wall and said, I don't think that this is supposed to be being done. This is being done for the wrong reasons. This isn't right. Don't do this. And so there's friction between Nehemiah and Tobiah. But apparently, Tobiah has friends, has relatives who are a part of the true Israel. And so the priest had converted one of the large storage rooms and placed it at Tobiah's disposal. The room had previously been used for storing the grain offerings, the frankincense, various articles for the temple, the tithes of grain, new wine, olive oil, which was prescribed for the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, as well as the offerings for the priest. I was not in Jerusalem at that time, Nehemiah writes, for I had returned to King Artaxerxes of Babylon in the 32nd year of his reign, though I later asked his permission to return. So when I arrived back in Jerusalem, I learned about Eliashib's evil deed. See how this is characterized here. I just want you to notice that it's been characterized not as nepotism at the worst, not as a bad idea, not as a use of the space, which needs to be changed now because we went it for something else. But it is an evil deed. It's ascribing a spiritual it's ascribing a spiritual character, a spiritual integrity, evil to this allowance of Tobiah using the storage space with room in the courtyards of the temple of God. I became very upset and threw all of Tobiah's belongings out of the room. Now, Nehemiah was governor. He had people. The temple had people. Like there were no shortage of individuals who were at the disposal of handling the running and the operation of the kingdom. Not the kingdom, but of the area, of the city, of the governance, of the government, of the temple itself. There are no shortage of people. There are Levites, there are priests, there are gatekeepers, there are singers. Nehemiah's governor had lackeys and attendants and other people, and yet I became very upset, and I threw all of Tobiah's belongings out of the room. The fact that Nehemiah himself does this speaks. Everything speaks. Again, it speaks to the heart. It speaks to the state of mind. It speaks to where Nehemiah is, that he personally does this. Up until now, remember, Nehemiah has not, to our knowledge, been in the temple. And we've said that we weren't even sure that Nehemiah was allowed technically to be in the temple if they were following the letter of the law. If he were a eunuch, he would have, under the letter of the law, been disallowed from that space. Then he demanded that the rooms be purified and brought back, and I brought back the articles for God's temple, the grain offerings, the frankincense. So it's unclean because Tobiah has used it. So it must be purified to rid it of the evil that is attached to this human being. Temper tantrums are telling. What we get upset about says more about us than the thing that upset us. What we get so upset about that it causes us to become physically violent, involved, to lose our self-control, always says a greater statement about us and what's going on inside of us than it does the situation itself. Even righteous anger, even if there be such a thing, righteous temper tantrums, still say more about us. Maybe it says good things about us. Maybe it doesn't, but temper tantrums are always telling, and this one tells us a great deal about Nehemiah. I also discovered that the Levites had not been being given their prescribed portions of food, so they and the singers who were to conduct the worship services had all had to return to work in the fields. And I immediately confronted the leaders and demanded, why has the temple of God been neglected? Then I called all the Levites back again and restored them to their proper duties. Now, again, on the surface, this is not a bad thing. There was a very clear system in place that was supposed to be taking care of the folks who were working in the temple so that they would not have to go and work and do their own thing and be split and divided between their focus on serving God professionally with their job and providing. Don't know that I'd say there's anything wrong with what Nehemiah does here, but again, we see that he involves himself personally in this. I immediately confronted the leaders and demanded. Says that Nehemiah is passionate about this. Why is Nehemiah passionate about this? Well, he's passionate about it for the same reason he's been passionate about everything that he has set his mind and his heart and his hands to throughout the entire book. He is passionate about things being done to the letter of the law that was written 700 years ago, even if it conflicts with what God has asked or how God has asked for inclusion or for change or for movement. So Nehemiah is trying to turn back the clock 700 years. And there have been 700 years of movement in the people, in their understanding of God, in their understanding of God's heart towards other people. So why roll back the clock 700 years? Is this noble? Is this warranted? Does this make Nehemiah holier, more committed, more conservative, more sanctified than other people? I would suggest no, especially because all of what Nehemiah is doing is reflected, as we've said, in a desire to limit the number of people who can have interaction with the one true God. And they're not limiting because they need to limit the number. They're limiting because they need to limit the type of person to the true Israel. Not just Israel, not just Jewish, not just kinfolk, but a limited segment of the Jewish people, a limited segment of the Israelites who are the true Israel. We hear this. I hear this a lot in the rhetoric right now about America, a true American, a patriot. There's a lot of talk about who are the real Americans and who are the outsiders, and what makes somebody a true American, and what makes somebody a poser or not a part of us. It's a ridiculous statement because none of us are true Americans unless we're living on an Indian reservation somewhere. You're not truly. We are all strangers in a foreign land here, and should be grateful for our opportunity to be a part of the blessings afforded to us by this land that we call America. And the same should have been true with Nehemiah and Israel. Anyone who was in proximity to the temple, living in the land, even if it had not been promised to them through the Abrahamic covenant, still, God said, should have been able to be partners in the receiving of the blessings of the land and of worship of God through partnership in the temple. But they keep shrinking the number of people, or the type of people, more rightly. And once more, all of the people of Judah began bringing their tithes of grain and new wine and olive oil to the temple storerooms. And I assigned supervisors for the storerooms: Shemaiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, Pedaiah, one of the to their fellow Levites. And then we have another prayer. Nehemiah has become notorious in moments like these for leveraging prayer. Remember this good deed, O my God. Do not forget all that I have faithfully done for the temple of my God and its services. God, I'm going to go beyond what you requested. I'm going to exclude others. I'm going to throw a temper tantrum. And God, I did it all for you. You made me do it. Don't blame me, guys. Don't blame me, God. The worst atrocities in human history are always committed in the name of God. The worst atrocities in communities, in nations, in families, in friendships are always committed in the name of God. So that we might, as Pilate, wasn't me. I was just doing what God said. Here's this law from 700 years ago. Take it up with him. This is not the way, Nehemiah. Until tomorrow.